Welcome to a show where you will hear about how our liberty is being eroded by the very people that swear an oath to protect it.
Today, the president signed a big new anti-terrorism bill that would expand the government's ability to track down terrorists, but at some cost.
On this show, we will discuss many of the lies that the government that hates us, by the way, we will discuss the lies that the people in positions of power and influence spread every day.
And what is the best way to confuse children? Confuse them about their sexuality, confuse them about their gender, expose them to things that their little brains are not ready for yet. That is how they are confusing children. It is leading to chaos, and Big Daddy government, of course, can be there to pick us all up and take care of us at the end of it.
We will also talk about how current elected leadership at all levels of government has been corrupted by power and control, as well as discuss the types of leadership needed to correct our republic's course.
We the people. It was time to remember that we the people are the government.
Providing assistance for the Ukrainians to defeat the Russians, that's the number one priority for the United States right now.
I am your host, Larry Linton, retired U.S. Navy Command Master Chief and prior Tennessee House of Representatives District 12 candidate, and welcome to the Liberty, Leadership, and Lies podcast. Welcome to this week's show, ladies and gentlemen. Yep, still working down here in New Mexico. Another week where the actual and the feels like temperatures have exceeded 100 degrees every day. This hotel stay, well, it's been, let's call it, exciting, to say the least. The hotel's fire alarm has gone off several times, right after I put head to pillow, too. Never when I was still awake and putting together notes on this engagement or while researching for the podcast. Nope. Every time the alarm has gone off has been when I was sleeping. Since my engagement in September will be in this same area, I'll definitely be looking at staying in a different hotel if this remains the norm for the remainder of my stay. Interrupted sleep is often worse than no sleep at all. Some of my work this past week definitely ties into today's topic on leadership. For a bit of background, I am not the only person working on this project. Many of you may know this, but for others that do not know, my personal company serves as a subcontractor with a much larger leadership consulting company for the contract I'm currently executing. Right now, for this particular project, there are 3 leadership coaches working in 3 different areas of the country, and we collaborate online all the time. And that's usually the case. Each of us are working with a bunch of small teams in our geographic areas, and each of these small teams are made up of anywhere between 5 and 20 people. For example, during my first week here, I worked with 2 teams that had about 20 people each on my first 3 days, and then the next 3 days I worked with 3 teams that had about 6 people each, along with various other numbers of third-party providers on the locations throughout the day. There's an assigned leader of each of these teams that we are actively coaching on safety, human performance, and leadership. Each of us coaches, we also interact with the individual members of the team to not only build relationships and trust, but to guide them to the overarching goal, finding for themselves, with their company's procedures that are already in place, what right looks like during their day-to-day operations. One of the topics the project manager asked myself and the other coaches in the field currently to work on was to try and list the good characteristics of what a leader of these small teams must embody, or live out in the day-to-day leading their teams and the managing of their equipment and the processes that are in place. That kind of brought me back to 1997. That was when I was going through Chief Petty Officer initiation while I was stationed on board the Special Operations Submarine USS Kamehameha out in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Let me tell you, over the course of those 2 months, between selection board announcement message in July and having my anchors pinned on my collar and the combination cover placed on my head on the 16th of September, there were a bunch of leadership lessons learned. And there was a test at the end of initiation that we had to pass, and we had to answer that question. What are the characteristics of a good leader? I learned many things over the course of my Chief Petty Officer initiation, both on how to be a good leader, as well as, sadly, learning from the many examples of poor leadership displayed by people that needed to be avoided. Then there were the many leadership styles and books that I've read and studied from that time up until the time I was selected to actually serve as the leader of a team of leadership facilitators for the entire fleet in my final assignment on active duty. We have discussed how humbling for me that selection was, but the reading and the learning did not stop there either. It continues even today. I still read books and articles every day. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of those items available to everybody on the internet, on Audible. There are many apps, just a plethora of information for me to study. Some of the best items on leadership that I find today come mainly from the book of Proverbs, as well as the many lessons captured in the Gospels about the pinnacle servant leader, Jesus Christ. So, there are a lot of resources that I've read that have assisted me with this project. They also guide me in the production of this podcast during discussions on the topic of leadership. Those resources, along with my lived experience, not only from my time on active duty and in my current role as a leadership consultant, but also as a husband, father, son, a member of my church, in my community, in my state, and in the nation. As we have discussed before on the topic of leadership, when you get down to what the essence of leadership is, it's really about influence. If you are influencing people, you're exercising leadership. You could be leading your family, leading your community, leading an organization. But that's just a bit of background. Let's get back to the project. When thinking about defining the characteristics of a good leader of one of these teams, it also led me to define the characteristics of what a bad leader looks like on one of these teams. After all, when trying to describe, quote-unquote, what right looks like, you also have to describe what wrong looks like. Sometimes that will leave some sort of gray area in between, because the two descriptions cannot be all-encompassing, capturing every scenario or situation that a leader of one of these small teams may encounter. But by providing good and bad characteristics, the left and right limits are there to help these leaders navigate those gray or undefined areas. Much as we discuss the errors of the Sevier County GOP not providing those left or right limits to the Republicans serving in elected office that represent the citizens of our county, the leadership of the local party did not provide the state representatives or the state senator with the information of what right looks like for the people of Sevier County. The good news is that other county Republican Party organizations in Tennessee have gone on record and, in doing so, have provided the left and right limits to their GOP state representatives and senators. And lo and behold, even the Tennessee Republican Party State Executive Committee officially came out against our governor's call for a special session. The special session, by the way, that begins this coming Monday at 4 p.m. Central Time in Nashville. We'll talk about that specifically in a bit, but keep this in mind. The Republican, which is debatable, by the way, the Republican governor of the state of Tennessee has ignored the wishes of the state's Republican Party, has ignored the left and right limits they have placed on what they expect from him. Transpublican Governor Bill Lee is not only mocking the will of the citizens and his political party, he is being contemptuous towards them. But let's get back to the project I was working on and then tie that into government. So, what are some of the characteristics of good leadership? I provided the project manager, who I call boss, by the way, and he really doesn't like it, but it's just all in jest. I provided him with some specifics that would apply to the leaders of these small crews. But I also gave him a few generalized ones that apply across communities, industries, and even in the personal spectrum. First, there's visible leadership, and that goes by many different names and terms. It is sometimes referred to as battlefield circulation or key leader engagements in the armed forces. Or in the corporate or civilian world, it's often called office circulation. However, you have to rethink what office means. Don't think of your standard office in a building. An office can, and often is, where a leader and his team meet and discuss the mission or the operation they are engaged in. So, in the world that I am coaching right now, that would mean the often remote locations at well sites the crew is working at. That is their office. It could also be in your home, your church, or your community life. That means it's just being present through active participation. This is especially true with raising children. Being present in their lives or being visible in their lives is a must. Because if you don't, the government, with their compulsory education requirements, will definitely be more present in their lives. And right now, all across the country, we are witnessing what happens when a majority of the citizens are not present through active participation in our system of self-governance, aren't we? There's also this fact. A leader cannot have a comfort zone. If you serve in a leadership position, you cannot hide in the comfort of an isolated office or space away from those you are charged with or elected to serve. That also means you have to make yourself uncomfortable when dealing with the government. Most often, that just means sacrificing a bit of your personal time in calling, writing, or visiting with elected officials. It's a small sacrifice in the grand scheme of things because, after all, it is your liberty, your freedom that is at stake when you remain in your comfort zone. A leader must also be flexible and wise enough or informed enough to face every problem affecting the readiness of their team or their community or their constituents. Or, when dealing with your elected representatives, that flexibility may take many forms, such as being polite, even when you are upset with the actions or votes of your representative. By staying flexible and engaged, you serve as a constant reminder of who they are supposed to represent. If you're not present and you're not engaged, they don't care. Now, if you recall, there was another aspect of good leadership that I discussed with the chairman of the Sevier County GOP. And that is this: good leaders empower their people. Now, the chairman, I believe he has a misguided definition of that term, which could be dangerous if he carries that over into his professional life as the sheriff of Sevier County. Because if it does, that would be like him hiring a new deputy, providing that deputy with a gun, a nightstick, and a fast car, then telling that deputy to go out and enforce the law, without training that deputy in the laws of the state and the nation, in the proper use of deadly force, along with the rules, regulations, policies, and procedures of the sheriff's office. That is essentially what he said the county executive committee of the Sevier County Republican Party is doing with our 2 state representatives and our 1 state senator. As I informed the chairman, empowerment comes through many avenues of exercising leadership, but it always comes with left and right limits clearly defined. Guardrails, I call them. Laws serve as guardrails to protect the citizen's liberty. Well, that is originally the purpose they were supposed to serve. Corporate policies are guardrails. Other examples of guardrails are written procedures, both operational and casualty procedures. The political party's written platforms are guardrails. And finally, the best man-made guardrail in written history, the Constitution of the United States of America. I digress, though. Included on the side of good characteristics of leadership is being transparent. That means you openly communicate the expectations you have for your team, while simultaneously soliciting what their expectations are of you while serving on your team. Information sharing is vital to the success of a team and the success of the leader. The moment that information sharing is throttled back or even completely stifled, that is when distrust moves in. Without trust, there can be no success, not in the personal, the public, the corporate, the military, or even the electoral arenas. A leader that is not trusted by their team, not trusted by their spouse or children, not trusted by their neighbors or the members of their community, or not trusted by their constituents, is no longer leading or serving effectively. Trust is like a mirror. Once it is broken, that mirror will never completely work as originally designed. Sure, you can put the broken pieces back together again, but the cracks will always be visible, often distorting the image seen, meaning that a leader that remains in a position after trust is broken, no matter the work put into repairing that trust, the cracks or the memories of the broken trust are always visible. Another characteristic of good leadership is a person that continuously demonstrates procedural compliance, meaning that if there are rules, regulations, policies, and procedures in place, the leader sets the example or sets the standard of performance for their team by always following them and ensuring their team does the same thing, and holds people accountable for not, including themselves. The good leader also understands when to seek higher authority when entering into those gray areas mentioned earlier. On the political side of that characteristic, that means elected officials follow the same rules and policies they expect for the citizens. Now, how far away from that have we gone? That is politicians on both sides of the political spectrum, too. It isn't just the communists that I'm referring to here, although they are by far and away the biggest violators of that good leadership characteristic. They are the leaders or the winners in the rules for thee and not for me category. If you've been anywhere near the internet or social media these past 2 weeks, I'm sure you've heard the song Rich Men North of Richmond by now. The man performing the song, which he wrote as well, is a young man who lives in Farmville, Virginia. And now the left has been out there denouncing his hit song as some far-right anthem. However, Oliver, the songwriter and performer, claims he is right down the center politically. And if you really listen to the lyrics, you would understand that. It is an anthem calling out the entire political class, the ruling elite or new aristocracy, as I have called them in the past, calling out those people in Washington, D.C. The song also references the topics of human trafficking and the government welfare state that is destroying our constitutional republic. There's a reference to something I mention quite frequently about how our government taxes us to no end. It uses that tax revenue, which is primarily comes from our sweat equity, to fuel their power and control, breaking our trust. Although those are views mainly held by constitutionally aligned citizens in our nation, who have been labeled as far-right extremists or the alt-right or some other such nonsense. Even Rolling Stone magazine is at it again regarding this song. Much like that publication attacked the movie Sound of Freedom and Jason Aldean's Try That in a Small Town hit, they have labeled this song as, quote, Oliver Anthony's Rich Men North of Richmond, right-wing country, unquote. Now, this song should be the anthem for every American that believes our government has far exceeded the left and right limits put on it by the Constitution. Oliver went on to say, quote, I remember as a kid the conservatives wanting war and me not understanding that. And I remember a lot of the controversies when the left took office. And it seems like both sides serve the same master. And that master is not someone of any good to the people of this country, unquote. Nowhere in his song does he go after liberals, commies, Democrats, Republicans, rhinos, transpublicans, or whatever political label you want to assign to a specific subgroup of politicians in D.C. He is singing about the entire group of people in our nation's capital. Here's just a sampling of the song's lyrics. Lord knows they all just want to have total control, want to know what you think, want to know what you do, and they don't think you know, but I know that you do. 'Cause your dollar ain't and it's taxed to no end. I wish politicians would look out for minors, and that's minors spelled M-I-N-E-R-S, And it goes on, and not just minors on an island somewhere. And that minors is spelled M-I-N-O-R-S. So you know what he's meaning there. The lyrics continue, Lord, we got folks in the street, ain't got nothing to eat, and the obese milking welfare. Well, God, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Young men are putting themselves 6 feet in the ground because all this country does is keep on kicking them down. Interesting, right? Didn't hear any particular political party called out. Now, if you hear or read those lyrics and they seem to you that they are pointing to a particular political party, that is on you. Because that is not what I think when I hear this song, and that's not what Oliver Anthony says when he wrote this song. What Mr. Anthony is talking about there is the basis of this week's topic. Now, before we go on, I provided some of the characteristics of good leadership. And let's recap them. They are visible, transparent, trustworthy, procedurally compliant, sets and enforces standards, and empowering. But what we are seeing in today's governance are the characteristics of bad leadership. They are not transparent, such as with their 4,000-page laws passed that none of them have read. Trustworthy is definitely not a word I would describe nearly every single one of them. Procedural compliance is a joke. Nearly every single one of the bills they pass, not just in Washington, D.C., but also in state capitals around the country, violate the biggest written procedure for government, the Constitution. When it comes to setting and enforcing standards, they accomplish that. One set of standards for themselves and a completely different one for the citizens. Nearly every elected official currently serving in office is an example of a bad leader. Often it isn't just bad, but a corrupt leader. Where elected officials mock not only the Constitution with their actions, but they also mock their oaths of office with their actions. When they do that, they are in turn mocking the citizens they are supposed to represent. They are treating each and every single one of us with contempt. Now, how exactly does this tie in with the trans-Republican Governor Bill Lee's call for the special session? I mean, besides him operating outside of the guardrails that the Tennessee Republican Party gave him, quite simple. If you recall, when we discussed the governor's constitutional authority to convene a special session, the governor can only call it for a specific set of reasons. Article 3, Section 9 of the Tennessee Constitution states that the governor may, quote, on extraordinary occasions, convene the General Assembly by proclamation, in which he shall state specifically the purposes for which they are to convene, but they shall enter on no legislative business except that for which they were specifically called together, unquote. Now, it calls for them to be specific, but here are trans-Republican Bill Lee's specifically stated purposes for the convening of this coming Monday's special session. He wants them to consider and act upon legislation regarding 1. Mental health resources, providers, commitments, or services. 2. School safety plans or policies. 3. Health care providers' duty to warn about potential violent offenses. 4. Offenses of committing acts of mass violence or threatening to commit acts of mass violence. 5. Reports from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation regarding human trafficking. 6. Identification of individuals arrested for felonies. 7. Law enforcement's access to criminal and juvenile records. 8. Law enforcement's access to information about individuals who are subject to mental health commitment. 9. Information about victims of violent offenses. 10. Stalking offenses. 11. Measures encouraging the safe storage of firearms, which do not include the creation of penalties for failing to safely store firearms, which is pretty good there. Here's the one that is the most concerning. 12. temporary mental health orders of protection, which must be initiated by law enforcement, must require a due process hearing, must require the respondent to undergo an assessment for suicidal or homicidal ideation, must require law enforcement to prove its case by clear and convincing evidence, must require that an order of protection be reevaluated at least every 180 days, and must not permit ex parte orders. Keep that one in mind. We'll talk about it here in a minute. 13, the transfer of juvenile defendants age 16 and older to courts with criminal jurisdiction, which must include appeal rights for the juveniles and the prosecuting authorities. 14, limiting the circumstances in which juvenile records may be expunged. 15, blended sentencing for juveniles. 16, offenses related to inducing or coercing a minor to commit an offense. That's interesting. 17, the structure or operations of state or local courts. And 18 has to deal with paying for it. So there's 18 specific items there. 17 items for consideration during this special session that is called under the extraordinary circumstance of a transgender woman killing 3 kids and 3 teachers. What does any of what he proposed have to do with transgender killing of Christian people? Nothing. Because he's going after guns. It appears like the governor in those 17 has cast a very wide net, and that will allow the other trans publicans in the General Assembly to put forth legislation, craftily worded legislation, whose purpose will be to usurp the liberty of the people. Every elected body in our country has become quite adept at wording legislation that on initial glance seems like a good thing. It is only after it is passed and signed into law, which is quite frequently the first time that many people even get to see the bill in its entirety, but it is only after passed and signed into law that we find out the law deprives the people of their liberty and concentrates more power into the hands of the government. Remember, our constitutions were established to limit government. Any law that puts limitations or conditions upon the people are anathema to what the Founding Fathers created and passed on to us. But number 12, like I said, is very concerning. Mental health order of protection that can only be initiated by law enforcement. Hey, isn't the news just full of how our law enforcement agencies have been weaponized against the people here lately? But that doesn't sound ominous at all, right? Other language in that reason that sounds like it is protecting the freedom of the citizens, but is the complete opposite, is this, quote, must require the respondent to undergo an assessment for suicidal or homicidal ideation, must require law enforcement to prove its case by clear and convincing evidence, and must require that an order of protection be reevaluated at least every 180 days, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, that may sound great, but let me ask you this. When it states that law enforcement must prove its case, doesn't that also mean the respondent or the defendant must also prove their case? That costs time and money. Lawyers and doctors for the respondent are not going to do this free of charge. Sure, there may be some pro-Second Amendment organizations, the Tennessee Firearms Association or the Gun Owners of America come to mind. They may step in to do some pro bono defense of an individual, but that just means the respondent is not paying. The organization or organizations doing the pro bono defense are spending their time, energy, and money doing that, leaving those organizations without those resources to work in other areas, like keeping government in check during their constant efforts to erode individuals of their constitutionally protected right to keep and bear arms. That, number 12, is a win-win for government all the way around. It's an added bonus for lawyers and doctors everywhere around the state. At least those lawyers and doctors that a defendant, the respondent, can afford to pay. It is also a win for those anti-Second Amendment communist organizations that are right now traveling around the state of Tennessee pushing for the denial of the basic human right of self-defense, which is enabled by out-of-state money and many in-state elected communists. A good rule of thumb is this, and is something the governor of Tennessee, as a Republican, has completely ignored. If the communists are for it, it is bad for the people and quite often unconstitutional. So please pay attention to what the General Assembly is doing during this special session. Stay in constant contact with your representative and senator, preferably by phone call. And if you can get to Nashville, please do so. Visit them and remind them of their oaths. You can also remind them that the state Republican Party Executive Committee is opposed to the special session, and any legislation that comes out of this that restricts any of our constitutionally protected liberties, well, they will be remembered on Election Day. Well, folks, that is it for this week. In closing, we have this week's wisdom from God's Word, and today it comes to us from Proverbs 18:3. Doing wrong leads to disgrace, and scandalous behavior brings contempt. Nearly every single person serving in elected office disgraces themselves with their mocking and contemptuous attitudes and behaviors towards the citizens they are supposed to be representing. It is their behavior that should cause each of us, no matter our political ideology, to treat them with contempt, especially on Election Day. Vote them out and elect people that will serve within the guardrails placed on government by our Constitution. Once again, thank you all for listening this week, and I pray that you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Until next week, stand in the arena with me. Reveille, it's time to wake up.